Ethan had never expected to end up this way. Once, he had been a man of action, a rancher in his prime with calloused hands and a steady hand on the reins. His reputation as a hard-working, determined man had spread across the Bitterroot Valley. The Callahan Ranch was a place of strength, pride, and grit, but now it was a shadow of its former self. Ethan had been a proud man, never one to ask for help. But now, with his body broken from the accident that had left him with bruised ribs and a limp that never quite healed, he was a man reduced to silence. The pain was constant, a dull ache that gnawed at him day and night, never allowing him peace. Yet, he continued, pushing through every day as if the past hadn't happened. His ranch was failing, and the winter winds were unforgiving. The cold had seeped into the bones of his home, just as it had settled into his soul. Ethan's stubbornness, however, kept him from asking for help. He'd spent his life doing everything himself, and he saw no reason to change that now, even as his body betrayed him. As the days stretched into weeks, memories of a different time haunted him. In his younger years, Ethan had been a social man, laughing with neighbors over campfires, sharing stories at the local saloon, and attending dances where he had once swept a young woman off her feet. He'd had friends, a future, and hope. But now, the only company Ethan had was his own thoughts, the whistling wind across the open plains, and the creaking of the old ranch house as it stood against the elements. Each memory of joy only deepened the loneliness he felt now. He had lost more than his physical strength in the accident. He had lost his sense of purpose. The ranch was struggling, his cattle weren't thriving, and Ethan was running out of options. The world felt heavier every day, yet he refused to surrender. Pride had a way of tying him to the land, and he believed it was all he had left. Despite the growing weakness in his body, he kept working, kept tending to the land, and kept hoping for a miracle that never came. Rose, on the other hand, had been running from something different. A woman in her late 20s, Rose had spent much of her life in the small town of Silver Creek, where whispers followed her at every turn. She had married young, thinking it was the answer to her dreams. But when her husband left her for a younger woman, the weight of shame and failure pushed her into a corner. People in Silver Creek spoke about her behind her back, and she couldn't bear the judgment any longer. Her failed marriage had become the talk of the town, and Rose found herself retreating into her own thoughts, wondering if she'd ever find a way to truly escape the life she had left behind. One morning, after days of staring at her reflection and feeling like a ghost in her own home, Rose made up her mind. She needed to change her life, to leave the past behind. The West had always fascinated her, its open skies, wide landscapes, and the idea that out there, people could start fresh. She had heard of women who had gone west as mail-order brides, hoping to find a new life. It seemed like the perfect opportunity for Rose to build a life of her own, far from the small-minded people who judged her. With a deep breath, she responded to an ad she'd seen in the newspaper. The man who had placed the ad was a rancher named Ethan. His words were brief but promising, seeking a wife to help with the ranch and make a life together. Must be strong, independent, and ready for hard work. That was all it took for Rose. She packed her belongings, wrote a letter to her parents telling them she was leaving, and bought a one-way ticket to the small town of Hamilton, Montana. The train ride was long, and Rose spent most of it staring out the window, watching the landscape change from the familiar towns and villages to the vast open spaces of the West. She was filled with a mixture of hope and anxiety. This was her chance to start over. But what if she wasn't what Ethan expected? What if she wasn't strong enough for the life he lived? Rose didn't know what awaited her, but she knew she couldn't stay in Silver Creek any longer. When the train finally pulled into the station, Rose stepped off onto the dusty platform, squinting against the sun that hung low in the sky. The small town of Hamilton was a far cry from the bustling streets of Silver Creek. It was quieter, more isolated. The buildings were old, the streets were empty, and everything seemed to stretch into infinity. Rose took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the town's silence, and checked the letter she had kept close to her heart. Ethan had promised to meet her here. As she waited, a part of her felt uncertain, but she pushed those feelings aside. This was what she wanted. This was what she needed. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance, and Rose's heart skipped a beat. She turned, hoping to see Ethan, but what she saw was a man on horseback, his figure outlined against the golden sky. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, was dressed in a weathered cowboy hat and worn boots, the kind of man who looked like he belonged to the land. The man who was supposed to be her future. Ethan. He rode up to her, his gaze steady, yet something about his eyes made Rose feel as if she were being studied. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the nervous flutter in her chest. Ethan stopped his horse just a few feet from her and dismounted with a practiced ease. His eyes, a dull blue, were shadowed with fatigue, and there was a tiredness in his movements that Rose couldn't ignore. "Rose?" he asked, his voice rough from years of hard work in the fields. "Yes," she replied, her voice wavering just a little. She tried to smile, but it felt stiff. Ethan studied her for a moment, as though he were searching for something. She wasn't sure what he was looking for, but she felt a strange sense of being both seen and unseen all at once. "Welcome to the ranch," he said simply, before nodding toward the horse. "Ready to ride?" Rose nodded, a sense of relief flooding through her. The man she had come to meet was here, and she was ready to face whatever came next. It wasn't just the beginning of a new life. It was a chance for both of them to heal from their pasts. And so, they rode together in silence toward Callahan Ranch, the vast Montana landscape stretching out before them as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. The journey ahead was unknown, but it was a start, one that neither of them could have predicted. The train's whistle faded into the distance as Rose stepped off the platform and onto the dusty ground of Hamilton, Montana. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty streets. The small station felt both welcoming and isolating, a place where time moved slower and the world seemed wider, stretching out in every direction. Rose checked the letter in her hand once more, its edges slightly curled from the long journey. The paper, creased from her constant handling, was her lifeline, her guide to a future that was now only a few steps away. The man she had come to meet was supposed to be here, somewhere. Ethan, her future husband, though she had never seen him. She wasn't sure what to expect. The idea of marriage, even under such unusual circumstances, felt foreign. And as the reality of the moment hit her, Rose couldn't shake the anxiety stirring in her chest. She was here to begin a new life, but she wondered if she was truly ready. The platform was empty, save for the few scattered passengers who had stepped off earlier, and the silence stretched between the station and the distant hills. Rose looked around, her eyes scanning the horizon. This town, so unlike her own, felt both too small and too vast. She was standing at the edge of something, but what exactly, she wasn't sure. As she adjusted the small suitcase in her hand, a slow rhythm of hoofbeats reached her ears. Rose looked up just in time to see a figure riding toward her, framed by the golden glow of the setting sun. The man who approached was tall, his silhouette sharp against the fading light, the wide brim of his hat casting a shadow over his face. Ethan. He rode up on horseback, his movements deliberate and steady, but there was something off about him, something in his posture that spoke of a weariness that couldn't be hidden by pride. As he slowed the horse, dismounting with a practiced ease, Rose noticed the way his hands shook as they gripped the reins. His face was pale, drawn from pain, and his body seemed to ache with every movement. Yet, he held his composure, masking the exhaustion and injury behind a quiet strength that was hard to miss. When Ethan stood before her, there was an awkward pause between them, neither knowing quite how to begin. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation. Rose's heart was pounding, but she stood her ground. She had made this decision, and now she would see it through, whatever it might bring. Ethan stared at her for a moment, his gaze appraising, his blue eyes searching her face, perhaps trying to figure out what kind of woman had arrived in his life. He was a man of few words, and this moment, this meeting, felt as foreign to him as it did to Rose. His lips parted to speak, but for a moment, he said nothing. Finally, Ethan offered her a stiff handshake. His palm was rough and callous from years of hard work, but it was unsteady, as though even that small gesture of connection was more difficult than it should have been. "Rose?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse, but sincere. "Yes," she replied, her voice a little shaky but strong enough to steady herself. The handshake lingered, but it wasn't warm. There was a tension in the air, a subtle unease between them that neither could avoid. Rose glanced at Ethan, taking him in, his tall, lean frame, the lines around his eyes that spoke of both hardship and endurance, the weariness in his posture that wasn't just from the long ride. She saw a man who had been broken by the land, a man who carried his burdens quietly, trying to hold it all together. "Glad you made it," Ethan said, his voice low, his eyes flicking down to the small suitcase in her hand. Rose nodded, trying to smile. "I'm here to help," she said, offering her words as much for herself as for him. It was the only thing she knew to say. She wasn't sure how to fit into this life, how to be the woman he needed, but she would try. There had to be something she could do, something to show him that she wasn't just a stranger, someone who was here, ready to share in his world, whatever that might mean. Ethan hesitated. His hands hung loosely at his sides, as if he were unsure whether to reach out or to retreat. There was a flicker of something in his expression, something hard to place. He wasn't used to help, certainly not from a woman who had come so far from the comforts of the world she had known. But there was something about her offer that stirred something deep inside him, something that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, a flicker of hope. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze softening just a touch. "It's hard work here," he said, his words coming slowly. "The land don't forgive, and I don't have much to offer but a roof and a chance to start fresh." Rose's heart thudded a little faster. She had come looking for a fresh start, but the reality of what Ethan's life might mean overwhelmed her. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't this quiet, reserved man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. She wondered if she could really help him, if she could make any difference at all. "I didn't come to be given anything," Rose said, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I came to work. I could do hard work. I'll earn my place here." Ethan gave a short nod, his eyes flicking over her face as if to gauge her sincerity. His words were few, but there was something in his gaze that spoke volumes. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened just slightly. "All right then," he said simply. "Let's head to the ranch. I'll show you what you've gotten yourself into." As they walked together toward the wagon, the silence stretched between them. It was not uncomfortable, but it was a silence full of unsaid things. Two people on the edge of something new, both unsure what the future would bring, but both willing to take the first step. For the first time, Rose felt a small but steady spark of hope, and though Ethan said nothing more, she felt a flicker of recognition in him as well. Neither of them knew exactly what the next days would bring, but they were going to face it together, whether they were ready or not. The journey to the Callahan Ranch had begun, and with it, a new chapter for both of them. One filled with challenges, yes, but also with possibilities that neither of them had anticipated. The wagon creaked along the uneven path, and the cold wind bit at Rose's skin. The air was sharp, with an edge to it that made her cheeks sting. The landscape around them was barren, stretching out for miles with nothing but the dusty earth and distant mountains. It was an endless stretch of nothingness, and for a moment, Rose wondered if she had made the right decision. But the thought quickly passed. She had come this far. She wasn't turning back now. Ethan sat beside her, his body rigid, yet his face showed the strain of his condition. His hands gripped the edge of the wagon, his knuckles pale, and his breath came in shallow gasps. Rose could see the effort it took for him to stay upright, each movement more labored than the last. She had already noticed the tremor in his hands, the way he grimaced as he shifted his weight. He was clearly in pain, but his pride kept him silent. She glanced over at him, noticing the way his jaw clenched as he tried to maintain his composure. He wasn't speaking, and she didn't know if it was because he didn't want to admit his weakness or if it was simply his way of dealing with pain. Either way, Rose knew he wasn't doing well. The journey to the ranch was long, and the cold would only make it worse. She didn't wait for him to say anything. With a quiet resolve, Rose took the reins of the wagon. Ethan looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but he didn't protest. He didn't say a word as Rose urged the horses forward, guiding them along the narrow trail. She had come to help, and no matter how much Ethan resisted, she wasn't going to let him suffer alone. The silence between them grew thicker as the minutes passed. Rose kept her focus on the path ahead, but she could feel Ethan's eyes on her, heavy with something she couldn't quite place. She wasn't sure if it was appreciation or frustration, but she didn't ask. She kept her focus sharp, determined to get them to the ranch, despite the tension between them. Ethan's silence was louder than words. He wasn't used to asking for help. That much was clear. It wasn't just physical strength he was trying to hold on to. It was his pride, his identity. He had built his life around self-reliance. And now, with his health failing, he was being forced to accept that he couldn't do it all alone anymore. That thought seemed to weigh heavily on him, but he said nothing. Instead, he watched Rose with a mix of appreciation and frustration. Appreciation for her willingness to take charge and frustration because he didn't want to be a burden. But Rose wasn't one to back down. The more Ethan pushed away, the more determined she became. She wasn't just here for the ride. She was here to help, and she would do whatever it took to make sure they both survived the journey. They didn't need to speak for her to understand his reluctance, and she knew she had to prove herself to him, not with words, but with actions. After what felt like an eternity of silence, the wagon finally crested a small hill, and the Callahan Ranch came into view. It wasn't much to look at, a simple house, weathered and worn by years of neglect. The land around it stretched out in every direction, barren and cracked under the harsh Montana sun. The ranch, like Ethan, had seen better days. Rose felt a pang of sympathy. She had come here expecting a life of hard work, but seeing the ranch in its current state made her realize just how much work there was to be done. The house looked lonely, standing in isolation with no signs of life other than the wind that swept across the empty fields. Ethan didn't say anything as they approached, but Rose could sense the weight of his pride. This was his place, and it had seen too many years of hardship for him to welcome anyone into it easily. When they finally stopped in front of the house, Rose climbed down from the wagon and glanced at him. He didn't meet her eyes. "This is it," he said shortly, his voice low and tight. Rose looked around, taking in the quiet, the desolation. She could tell that this place had witnessed more sorrow than joy, and she understood immediately that this wasn't just a home for Ethan. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for and lost. She turned to him, hoping to offer comfort, but before she could speak, Ethan brushed her off. "I can manage," he said, his tone curt. "I don't need help." Rose felt the sting of his words, but she didn't let it show. She knew this wasn't about her. It was about Ethan, about his pride, about his struggle to hold onto the life he had built. She wanted to reach out, to tell him that it was okay, that she was here to help, but she understood why he couldn't accept it. She saw the wall he had built around himself, and she wasn't sure if she could ever break through it. But Rose wasn't one to give up easily. She had come here to help, and she wouldn't walk away just because Ethan refused to admit his need for assistance. So, without asking for permission, she began tending to the wagon. She unloaded the supplies and arranged them neatly, organizing everything with a focus that matched the determination she felt inside. She didn't wait for Ethan to say anything. Instead, She worked quietly, taking care of the things that needed to be done. Ethan watched her, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. His pride still whispered at him, telling him to turn away, to do it all himself, but his body was telling him something different. His shoulders sagged under the weight of his exhaustion, and he realized, reluctantly, that he couldn't do it alone anymore. But he wasn't ready to admit that yet. He stood there in silence, unsure of what to say, as Rose continued to work. There was a flicker of something in his chest, something that wasn't just frustration, but something softer, something he wasn't ready to face. It was the first crack in the wall he had built around himself, and he couldn't quite bring himself to acknowledge it. Rose didn't push him. She kept her focus on the task at hand, determined to prove that she was more than capable. She wasn't going to let his pride keep him from accepting help. And as the minutes passed, she could feel the tension between them starting to ease. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a beginning. They weren't speaking much, but there was a connection forming in the silence, a connection that neither of them fully understood, but both of them could feel. In the end, it wasn't words that would bring them together. It would be the work, the shared effort, and the quiet understanding that neither of them could face the challenges ahead alone. For now, they would move forward in silence, both of them slowly realizing that they had more in common than they had thought. The journey to the Callahan Ranch had only just begun, and with it, so had their shared story. As the days passed, Ethan's health continued to deteriorate. His injuries, both physical and emotional, were taking a toll on him. The pain in his body was unrelenting, a constant reminder of the accident that had changed everything. He could feel his strength slipping away, but his pride refused to let him admit it. His hands trembled when he tried to work, his breath shallow and labored, and yet he refused to let anyone see how bad it had become. He told himself that he could handle it, that the ranch was his responsibility, but each day it became harder to ignore the truth. Rose, however, saw through his facade. She had watched him struggle, and she couldn't stand by and let him suffer. She knew that if she didn't take charge, nothing would get done. Without hesitation, she began caring for him, learning quickly how to tend to his wounds. She cleaned his cuts and bruises, changing the bandages with practiced care, though she had never done it before. The first time she saw the raw, angry marks on his skin, her heart broke for him. She knew that his pain wasn't just physical, but there was no time for tears. Rose also started fixing the broken fences around the ranch. She cleaned up the yard and mended the buildings, making them livable again. With each task she completed, Ethan grew more and more reluctant to accept help, but he couldn't avoid it. He watched her, his pride battling with his growing need for assistance. He had always been the one to handle everything, and it was hard for him to accept that he couldn't manage it all on his own. But slowly, he found himself relying on Rose more than he ever expected. It wasn't just the ranch that needed fixing, it was him. There was a strange peace that settled over Ethan when she was near. The quiet, steady way she worked, her presence in the house, and the comfort she offered without asking for anything in return gave him a sense of relief he hadn't felt in years. Her gentleness with him, the way she cared for him without judgment, was something he didn't know he needed. His pain, both physical and emotional, began to fade into the background whenever she was around. Still, Ethan struggled with the truth of his situation. The ranch was his life, but so was his pride. And letting go of that pride was harder than anything else. But as Rose continued to work tirelessly, Ethan couldn't help but notice the growing connection between them. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected someone like Rose to come into his life and change everything. His body still ached, and his spirit was still broken, but for the first time, there was someone by his side who was willing to share the weight. He couldn't ignore the fact that there was more to this than just physical care. One evening, as Rose was fixing a broken fence, Ethan sat on the porch, watching her work. He could feel the weight of his past creeping back into his mind, and it was harder to push it away with her around. It wasn't just the injury or the pain that held him back. It was the wounds in his heart, the ones he had never let anyone see. His fiancée had left him years ago, and the bitterness that had followed still clung to him, as fresh as the day she walked away. He had tried to forget her, to move on, but the grief was still there, buried deep inside him. It was easier to focus on the ranch, to pour all his energy into the land, than to face the emotions that were tied to the past. But now, with Rose's presence, the memories came flooding back. He didn't know how to deal with them. Rose could see the change in him. He was still the same man who had avoided talking about his past, who kept everything locked inside. But she could tell that the silence wasn't just from a lack of words. It was from the weight of everything he had been through. She watched him for a moment, then approached him slowly. There was no rush. She wasn't going to force him to speak. But when she sat down next to him on the porch, she could feel the tension in his body, the walls he had built around himself. "You don't have to tell me everything," Rose said quietly, her voice gentle but firm. "But if you ever want to talk, I'm here." Ethan's gaze shifted to her, his eyes shadowed with a mix of pain and reluctance. He opened his mouth to speak, but stopped himself. The words were stuck, lodged in his throat. He didn't want to admit to her what had happened, what still hurt, but something about her presence made it harder to stay silent. She was offering him something he hadn't had in years, a chance to heal. For a long moment, Ethan didn't speak. His hands tightened on the edge of his chair, and his jaw tensed. But then, finally, the words came, rough and slow, as if he hadn't used them in ages. "I had a fiancée once," he said, his voice low. "She was the one. At least I thought she was." He paused, looking out at the fading light on the horizon. "She left me just before the wedding. Left me with nothing but a broken heart and a reputation to mend. The hardest part wasn't losing her. It was the way it made me feel about myself. Like I wasn't enough. Like nothing I had built was worth anything." Rose listened, her heart aching for him. She could see the pain in his eyes, the way the past still held him captive. She reached out, her hand gently resting on his arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Ethan looked at her, his gaze conflicted. "I've been carrying that with me ever since. It's easier to focus on the land. At least the land doesn't leave." Rose's hand stayed on his arm, warm and steady. She knew the weight of grief. She knew what it was like to be trapped in the past, to feel like there was no way forward. But she also knew that healing wasn't something that could happen overnight. It took time, and it took someone who was willing to be there. "You're not alone, Ethan," she said softly. "You don't have to carry all of this by yourself. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, Ethan let his guard down just a little. The wall he had built around his heart wasn't gone, but it had cracked just enough for Rose to see inside. She wasn't going to fix him, and she wasn't going to erase the pain, but she was willing to help him heal. And in that moment, Ethan realized that he didn't have to face this alone anymore. The sun had barely risen when the first knock came. Rose had been awake for hours, tending to the ranch as best as she could, the weight of the land dispute hanging heavily over her. Ethan's health was still fragile, and his reluctance to accept help from her was only adding to the strain. But the knock at the door changed everything. A group of developers had arrived in town, their intentions clear. They wanted to expand the railroad through Ethan's land, pushing forward a project that would destroy everything he had worked for. The men who came to meet him were smooth-talking, well-dressed, but their eyes held a coldness that sent a shiver down Rose's spine. They spoke of compensation, of progress, of how this was all part of the greater good for the town. But Ethan knew the truth. This wasn't about progress, it was about greed. The developers didn't care about the land, about the history, or about the life Ethan had built. All they saw was an opportunity to take what wasn't theirs, and they would stop at nothing to get it. Rose could see the tension in Ethan's posture as he stood face to face with them. She could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of his pride, and the growing desperation to protect the ranch. This was a fight Ethan had never anticipated, but it was one he would have to face, whether he liked it or not. Rose found herself caught between two worlds: the man she had come to care for and the life she had built for herself. She wasn't just going to sit back and watch as Ethan's land was taken from him, but she also didn't want to lose herself in the process. She had come to this ranch to help, but she hadn't expected to have to fight so soon. Her heart told her to stand by Ethan, but her mind reminded her that she still had her own independence to protect. The tension between them grew, a silent battle playing out in the quiet moments. Ethan, ever the proud man, refused to accept help, even as the developer's offer loomed large. Rose, determined to stand by him, insisted they fight back, but Ethan's pride wouldn't let him see reason. They argued fiercely, their voices raised in the quiet house. Ethan's unwillingness to ask for help clashed with Rose's determination to fight for their future. Every word they spoke seemed to drive them further apart, but Rose wouldn't back down. "You can't do this alone," Rose shouted, her frustration bubbling over. "You're not the only one who has something to lose here. This land, this ranch, it's ours, and I'll fight for it." Ethan's eyes flashed, a storm brewing behind them. "I don't need you to fight for me," he spat, his voice cold. "This is my battle. I don't need anyone else to save me." But Rose didn't flinch. She had already made her choice. She would not stand by while Ethan lost everything, not when he had fought so hard to hold on to it. The argument hung in the air, thick with unspoken words, but as the days passed, the situation only worsened. The developers were relentless, and the pressure on Ethan mounted. His health, which had been steadily declining, reached a breaking point. One night, as he lay in bed, a deep, aching pain gripped him, and he collapsed, unable to move. The years of fighting, the constant stress, and his injuries had finally caught up with him. Rose was at his side in an instant. She had never imagined she would be in this position, taking control of a ranch that wasn't hers to protect a man who had spent months pushing her away. But there was no time to hesitate. She couldn't let Ethan go. She refused to let him give up, even if it meant stepping into a role she never anticipated. As Ethan lay unconscious, his breathing shallow, Rose moved quickly. She checked his wounds, ensured he had everything he needed, and began to make plans. The developers would not win, not if she had anything to say about it. Rose knew the ranch was a symbol of everything Ethan had worked for, and she couldn't let it slip away, not on her watch. While Ethan slept, his dreams were filled with memories of his past, the love he had lost, the promises that had been broken. In his dreamlike haze, he saw his fiancée again, the woman who had left him just before their wedding, the woman who had taken his heart with her when she walked away. The pain of that loss, the guilt, and the regret surged within him. He had failed her, failed to protect their future, and now he was failing again. He couldn't protect the land, couldn't protect the ranch. He wasn't enough. But in the darkness of his unconsciousness, Ethan felt something he hadn't in a long time: a presence. It wasn't the familiar weight of his own guilt. It was something else, something lighter. It was Rose. He could hear her voice in the distance, soft but steady, telling him that everything would be okay, that he wasn't alone. She was there, fighting for him, just as she had promised. When Ethan finally woke, he found himself staring at the ceiling, the weight of his body heavy with exhaustion. He turned his head, and there, standing in the doorway, was Rose. She was tired, her face drawn with the weight of the responsibility she had taken on, but there was a strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I won't let you do this alone," she said softly, her voice steady. Ethan blinked, confusion clouding his mind. "You're still here." Rose smiled, though it was small and tired. "Of course I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, something inside Ethan shifted. The walls he had built around his heart began to crack. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something other than pride and guilt. Rose hadn't just been a caretaker or a helper. She had become his anchor, the one person who refused to let him go. And in that quiet moment, Ethan realized that he wasn't the only one fighting for survival. Rose had sacrificed her own peace, her own comfort, to fight for him. And for the first time, he allowed himself to lean on someone else. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, Ethan didn't feel alone. And with Rose by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next together. After a long, tense struggle, Ethan and Rose prepared to defend their ranch from the developers who aimed to expand the railroad through their land. The developers had underestimated them, thinking Ethan's weakened health would stop him from resisting. But together, Ethan and Rose rallied the community, calling on those who owed loyalty to the land and Ethan's family. When the developers arrived, they faced not just a sick man, but a united front of people ready to protect what was theirs. In the confrontation that followed, Ethan's strength returned, fueled by Rose's presence and unwavering support. They fought not only for the land, but for a future they could build together. The developers, faced with fierce resistance, ultimately relented, realizing they couldn't overpower the unity and determination of Ethan and Rose. With the dust settling and the threat finally gone, Ethan understood that Rose had become far more than his mail-order bride. She had become his equal, his partner, standing beside him through everything. In the quiet of the victory, he offered her a simple but heartfelt proposal. Rose, with tears in her eyes, accepted, knowing that this wasn't just about marriage. It was about standing together for a future. As the sun set over the ranch, Ethan and Rose sat side by side, looking out at the land they had fought for. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Ethan placed his hand over hers, and together they made a quiet promise to continue fighting for each other, for the ranch, and for the family they were beginning to build. The future was uncertain, but as long as they faced it together, they knew they could handle whatever came their way.